A warm welcome to every single one of you who have joined us today, from whatever time you are joining us at. And I am extremely honored to be able to present this book launch of Ariella Aïsha Azoulay's The Jewelers of the Ummah, A Potential History of the Jewish Muslim World. My name is Nondumiso Lwazim Simanga, and I am VIAD's Radical Others Research Coordinator, and I will be moderating this conversation today. I am going to begin by introducing you to the Radical Others Research Stream at VIAD Research Center, which is hosting this book launch today. So, as the research coordinator, Radical Others Research Stream has a number of focus areas, and the focus areas are radical feminisms, radical mobilities, radical ecologies, as well as radical digitalities. This book launch today sits under the radical mobilities, where we explore the politics of movement and displacement within the African diaspora through an intersectional lens. Radical mobilities examines how cultural practitioners navigate borders and boundaries by challenging these divisive legacies of coloniality and globalization. Radical mobilities are essential to the Radical Others research stream as they acknowledge and amplify the voices which are often silenced, marginalized, or erased through colonization, imperialism, and its otherings. By interrogating how movement, migration, and displacement shape identities and living histories, Radical Mobilities hopes to challenge dominant narratives of nationhood, citizenship, and general belonging, as well as the architectures of racial capitalism. I would like to say hello now to Professor Ariella Aïsha Azoulay. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak in this context. It is the right context for the book. Yeah, if I may just say one thing about the book, I started to write it maybe when I was already writing, potential history and learning imperialism, because I started the research on Algeria and the colonization of North Africa by the French much earlier than I started to write this book. And the book deals with several genocidal projects, European genocidal projects. And as I was finishing the book, the genocide in Gaza started. And in a way, writing about European genocidal projects in Europe and in its colonies was already accounting for the long history of the genocide in Palestine, and the genocide in Gaza made me think about this book in a different way. And the last couple of months of writing this book before submission were already within the genocide. And I wanted to start by saying this because we have to acknowledge the genocide that is still going on despite the ceasefire. So thank you for inviting me to share my work here. And I'm happy to be in conversation with all of you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that note on the genocide and the importance of the entanglements that you're looking at in the book itself. So to introduce those of you who may not have read the book itself, who may be less familiar with Professor Azoulay as well, I'm going to share the biography of our author, and then I'm going to share also the bios of the correspondents who are going to be speaking with Professor Azoulay today. So as part of our publicity for this book launch, we sat with this quote sourced from Verso Books, who has happily collaborated with us in making sure that this event was possible. And in this quote, Professor Azoulay says, "To be an Algerian Jew is to revolt." So something about thinking as a jeweler is also to think about revolution and identity. The author, Ariella Aïsha Azoulay, is somebody who teaches at Brown University, teaching political theory from an anti-colonial perspective, using photography, craft, and jewelry to study onto-epistemological violence perpetrated through institutions and technologies like museums, archives, and nation states. Potential History and Unlearning Imperialism, developed in her previous book, Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, also published with Verso Books. These are key concepts and an approach that she has developed over more than a decade, concepts having far-reaching implications for the fields of political theory, archival formations, museum and photography studies, as she shows in her two recent books, The Jewelers of the Ummah, Potential History of the Jewish Muslim World, and Collaboration, A Potential History of Photography. A new edition of her 2012 book recently came out. The book Civil Imagination, The Political Ontology of Photography, is also published by Verso Books. And Azoulay also published The Civil Contract of Photography and From Palestine to Israel, A Photographic Record of Destruction and State Formation, 1947 to 1950. Azoulay is also a film essayist and independent curator. Among her films, The World Like a Jewel in the Hand, Unlearning Imperial Plunder 2, Undocumented, Unlearning Imperial Plunder 1, and Civil Alliances, Palestine 47 to 48. And among her exhibitions are Errata and The Natural History of Rape. Again, thank you to Professor Azoulay for joining us today. Our correspondence, and briefly a note about how today's book launch is framed. In the book, Ariella writes letters, and in these letters to fellow anti-colonial thinkers, people who were involved in Algeria's history, and ancestors. So in today's book launch, we're going to be listening also to people who have written to Ariella, thinking about her work and the intersections with their own work. Our correspondents today are Professor Alexandra Kokoli. Professor Alexandra Kokoli is Associate Professor in Visual Culture at Middlesex University in London. She is an art historian and theorist originally trained in comparative literature. Alexandra researches the aesthetic mobilization of discomfort to political ends, and she focuses on art practices informed by and committed to feminism, committed to the fraught but fertile relationship between feminism and psychoanalysis, death, mourning, and shame. Alexandra curated Burnt Breakfast and other works by Sue Richardson and has published widely on feminism art and visual culture in journals, including Art Journal, Women and Performance, N. Paradoxa, Performance Research, Oxford Art Journal, and Hypatia. Her books include The Feminist Uncanny in Theory and Art Practice and, as editor, Feminism Reframed, Reflections on Art and Difference, and The Provisional Texture of Reality, Selected Talks and Texts by Susan Hiller. Our second correspondent is Professor Jennifer Bajorek. And Professor Jennifer Bajorek is a scholar, writer working on questions at the intersection of photography, art, and poetry. She has a particular interest in the aesthetic aftermaths of colonialism in French and Francophone worlds, with a cultural and geographic focus on the African continent. At Hampshire, Jennifer Bajorek teaches interdisciplinary courses on literature, fiction, experimental nonfiction and poetry, photography and film, as well as philosophies of the image and and of liberation. Bajorek has published and taught on a wide array of cultural texts, objects, and spaces, on African photographic archives and decolonial historiography, Francophone, European, African, and Caribbean literature and film, Marxist, post-Marxist, and post-colonial theory, as well as topics in contemporary art, African and African diaspora history, as well as art history and critical museum and heritage studies. Jennifer Bajorek's work also includes translation, curating, and diverse forms of collaboration. Both of these correspondents with Professor Ariella Azoulay today are also research associates at VIAD Research Center, and we're really pleased to have them with us today. In absentia today, another correspondent with Azoulay is Professor Emery Kalema. Professor Emery Kalema excuses himself from this moment, but will be joining it on YouTube through our recording. So please let people know that they can do that as well. Professor Emery Kalema is busy today with the final day of his conference on Congolese histories and temporalities. Professor Emery Kalema holds a PhD in history from the University of the Witwatersrand. He was a postdoctoral fellow at both the Institut de Sociologie at the Université Libre de Brussels and South African Research Chair in Historical Trauma and Transformation at Stellenbosch University. In addition, Emery Kalema is also a summer program in Social Science Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and the winner of the competition for the inaugural Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora. Emery Kalema has a research fellowship at New York, had a research fellowship at New York University in the fall of 2019, and Kalema is the recipient of the 2021 Central African Studies Association Essay Prize for the best published article by a junior scholar. His research interests include power and politics, body and embodiment, violence, memory, trauma, and suffering. He's currently working on a book project tentatively titled Violence and Memory, The Mulele Rebellion in Post-Colonial Congo, to be published by Duke University. And Professor Kalema works currently at the Global Studies University Africa Institute. I begin with this excerpt in order to invite Ariella to give us some context into specifically this moment of the book as an introduction to how you write and why you write.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction, this generous introduction, and for starting with a quotation from a letter that I wrote to Benjamin Stora, who is a historian who was born in Algeria, in Constantine, and left Algeria with many other Jews in 1962. When Algeria gained its moment of decolonization that was conflated, I would say, with independence. I think that decolonization is one project and independence is another, but Algerians were managed to dismantle the colonial regime that lasted in Algeria for 132 years. And Benjamin Stora was invited several years ago by the French president to write a report on French crimes in Algeria. It was the second report that the French president commissioned in relation to Africa. The first one was the Salle-Savoie report about the plunder of objects, and the second one is about the crimes committed in Algeria. And this report that many waited to read was very hard to read because there were no imperial crimes in it. And when I wrote to Benjamin Stora, there were very few imperial crimes, I would say, but the major imperial crimes that France committed in Algeria were not there. And I wrote to Benjamin Stora a letter as an Algerian Jew. And as you started your introduction of me with this quotation, to be an Algerian Jew is to revolt. Why is it to revolt? Because imperialism and several colonial projects destroyed our modes of belonging to different worlds. And to claim today that I am an Algerian Jew is actually to claim an identity that was made inexistent. Because of the French colonization of Algeria and the Zionist colonization of Palestine. So reclaiming the identities of my ancestors from the maternal side, a Palestinian Jew, and from my paternal side, an Algerian Jew, is actually to revolt against imperial borders, imperial identities, imperial plunder. So this book was written in a different way that I wrote my other books, but it continues the other books in the sense that I am always looking for the way to engage with what I'm writing about, because I'm not writing about, topics that are not related to the world in which we live. And as I write about the world in which we live that was brutally shaped by imperialism, I'm always looking for interlocutor to in the process of writing. And in this book, it took this shape of writing letters, writing open letters. It is an expression, on the one hand, of an academic fatigue, I would say, that we are invited forever to write about those horrible crimes that leave so many scars in our bodies, to write on them as if we were only scholars. Also to write about others who misunderstood different moments in this process, but they are nonetheless our allies, to write about them in the third person rather than engage with them in a conversation. So the format of the letter enables me several things. One of them, maybe the most important, is to address in the second person, to use the first person, and to create an epistolary space in which I spend sometimes years with my interlocutors. So my interlocutors are on the one hand my kin, my father, my mother, my two great-grandmother that I didn't know, but also elected kin, like Frantz Fanon, like Hannah Arendt, like Sylvia Wynter, like Horea Boutelja, and several others. So in this space, actually, when I have some critique about what they wrote, it's not an opportunity for me to criticize them as if they were the objects of my research, but to engage in a conversation and ask questions and bring the answers, from their writings and from these, particular encounters that the epistolary space enable us to have and to dwell in for a long time. Writing those letters came together with making jewelry, reproducing my ancestors' craft, but maybe I'll keep this for the upcoming questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And for our guests, I would like to return to your correspondence with Benjamin Stora and remind us of what it is that you wrote to him. You said, if you had replied to the invitation which you have framed as an invitation by the French government to write a report, asserting your position as an Arab Jew, a Berber Jew, a Muslim Jew, a victim of the French colonization of Algeria, you would have asked to co-author this report with a Muslim French Algerian. That would have been an opportunity to depict a fuller picture of imperial crimes and their lingering consequences, and to impose on the French state who commissioned the report a reversal of the fifth exile of the Jews. Their alienation from Arabs and Muslims in the New World, they found themselves sharing in France. With these gestures, even an official report could have provided us as descendants and our own descendants with the resources to continue the work of abolishing imperial technologies. It would have provided us the tools to appreciate your books volumes, and catalogs, not as a civilizational fresco of 2,000 years, but as a living tapestry of a world that we have the right to inhabit and reclaim, with the hope to reverse these exiles, one after the next, or all at once. Ariella Aïsha, a descendant from Oran. And I do this repetition to signal us into the correspondence we're about to enter into with Alexandra, Jennifer, and Emery in absentia. I do it in order for us to cue ourselves into listening again in a different way, not just with the kind of academic tones and argumentation that we're used to doing, but to come into the letter writing mode of conversation, of appealing, of trying to make sense of how we unlearn imperialism and what it means to address the potential history of the Jewish Muslim world. And with that, I'm going to begin by inviting Alexandra Kokoli to read for us her first correspondence with Ariella.
Thank you, Nondumiso. Dear Professor Azoulay, on page 9 of your book, The Jewelers of Ummah, there is a picture of a handful of coins, a hand full of coins, from Algeria that were gifted to you by Shamira Negrouche for the preparation of a breastplate. I imagine this to be your hand, busy between writing letters and stringing beads and coins onto different threads. I think about the women's postal art project Feministo, by which I felt addressed many decades after it began and possibly ended, and which set me on the road to becoming an art historian of women's movements. Co-founder of the Postal Art Network, Phil Goodall, described Feministo as consciousness-raising in material form, and her words profoundly shaped my understanding of both art and feminism. Is your book, then, a textual iteration of a larger unlearning operation that also takes place in material form, speaking through the craft of jewellery making, the embodied recovery of a censored skill? And if so, what forms does this material iteration take? Is it a postal art network, gift exchanges, an exhibition in progress?
Yeah, thank you so much for posing this question, raising this question, also in the format of a letter. I'm touched by this. And as a way of replying, I would like to share with you, some images. So first of all, I would like to show the audience, the image that you talk about. This is, in fact, my hand, full of coins. But before going back to this image, let me start with the project of the book and saying something broader about what motivated me. We are living, as I already said, in a world that was brutally shaped by imperialism. And the question is what remains is a crucial question. And in this particular case that I'm engaged with, I cannot say even studying, because it is not only an academic study, it is also about who I am, who are my children, who are my grandchildren, and what can I transmit to them under the condition that the world of my ancestors was destroyed, and was destroyed without leaving any trace in the archive as a destruction. So we are speaking about a destruction with the elimination of the idea that such a world even existed. If you will Google, you will not find much about Muslim Jewish world. So what was left is posed for me as a question, because we Muslim Jews, Arab Jews, Berber Jews, Amazigh Jews, North African Jews, African Jews are no longer in the land of our ancestors, and no longer being in the lands of our ancestors has many implications that are related to the question that you ask about, embodied knowledge about material form. So I would like to go from this, general assumption, or not assumption, observation, that we no longer live in the lands of our ancestors, in the world of our ancestors, poses a question: how do we start to engage with what was destroyed? And this has some other, implications that I would like to show them very briefly through several images. If you look at this photograph of one of the famous squares in Algeria, in Alger, what you recognize immediately is this beautiful mosque. But this beautiful mosque is really like a kind of museum object in the square. The square was cleansed of many traces of Algerian life, and the square that we tend today to associate with a flat surface was actually the lower part of the Kasbah, of a hill, that is recognizable as the visual entrance to Alger from the sea. So the destruction of everything that surrounded the mosque and leaving only the mosque was actually preparing a theater that is Europe versus Islam. From this theater, the Jews were actually eliminated epistemologically before they were eliminated by other means, like the colonization through citizenship, etc. So in this square, underneath this square, actually lies the Jewish-Muslim world. Lies the Jewish-Muslim world. It is entangled with craft making, that is entangled with many types of craft. And this is, the French colonization always goes, in two directions that are totally enmeshed. Destruction and producing documentation to preserve in their archives. So as they destroyed the lower Kasbah, where all these artisans, Jews and Muslims, worked together, they also documented all the streets. So this is the street of those who prepare shoes. This is the street of those who prepare jewelry, which are the jewelers of the Ummah, what gave the book its title, because the Jews, since the inception of Islam, were the jewelers of the Ummah, were those who prepared jewelry and actually worked with metal and fire. So looking at this map and imagining what was there before it was destroyed and became this kind of flat square that today is known to be the Place des Martyrs, the Square of Martyrs, was for me an invitation to not only study the destruction of this world that has no place in the chronologies of imperial violence, but also to reproduce objects that my ancestors prepared, but not as objects in order to become an artist. So here I am already replying to another aspect in your question. This is not an art project. This is a life project, I would say. This is an anti-colonial project. This was an attempt to think about those objects that my ancestors prepared, made, as part of being part of the Ummah, of the Islamic nation, as a different way to understand our identities before our identities were reduced to ethnic groups or to religious groups, that these are colonial taxonomies. So what I try to do as I delved into this research is actually awaken my muscular memory. If my ancestors were the jewelers of the Ummah, it is impossible that colonialism arrived to completely erase those muscular memories. So the idea was how to revive them. And at the same time, how to unlearn imperialism. And here, in one of the colonial albums that I found, what you see are two images of two Algerian women. They were once captioned as Jewish type with quotation mark, and then the Jewish was erased, and you got the Arab type, which Arab are obviously not not in contradiction with being Jew, because Jews were Arabized, like they were Islamized, like Amazigh in general were Judaized before were Arabized and Islamized. So looking at these photographs, this colonial photograph was not only looking at photographs, but was also looking at the jewelry that my ancestors did and trying to understand what does it mean to have this kind of dexterity in my hands that will allow me to make them. So one of the first books that provoked this understanding that my project will be the jewelers of the Ummah is a book by Wasila Tamzali, an Algerian, a Muslim Algerian who wrote in the 80s a wonderful book called Abzim about Algerian jewelry. She is also a feminist lawyer, and she also wrote about Algerian cinema, etc. So taking her book and trying, first of all, to draw these, this incredible breastplate, and then to start to pierce the coins and prepare also the same necklace, not by being a jeweler, not by going to RISD art school in order to learn how jewelry is being taught only as an occupation that produces objects, but try to understand what does it mean to have these coins? What does it mean to have the coins that many of which came from the colonizers, right? Because if the jewelers for centuries prepared, pendative, with the colonial invasion and the invasion of colonial coins, the jewelers that, the infrastructure of jewelry making was destroyed. They invented a new way to integrate those coins into their jewelry. So going back to this hand with the coins, Samira Negrouche, in the process of writing this book, when I published, I think, the letter to Benjamin Stora, she emailed me. I didn't know her. She's an incredible Algerian poet. She emailed me, and we started a correspondence that landed in the book as one of the letters. I didn't plan to write to Samira Negrouche. I didn't know her, but she, when she wrote to me, it opened up not only a door, but a way for me to continue the writing, not about this world, but inhabiting this world with my interlocutors, because she became one of the important interlocutors in this book. So the exchange obviously went also through exchanging objects, and she gave me those coins. You see Samira Negrouche here on the right side, around a table that I am activating when I'm inviting descendants or diaspora, Maghrebi diaspora, to sit together in fabrication narration workshops, because the idea was not that I will know only for myself how to prepare those pieces of jewelry, but how do I share with others this opportunity to awaken their muscular memory. So what you see here is the same map that you saw earlier of the destroyed Jewish Muslim artisanal world, and that is being retraced with Algerian jewels. And on the table, you have images, you have pieces of jewelry, and there are 20 people around it that are actually exchanging what they have, the bits and pieces of their muscular memory with what I share with them, and they prepare jewelry. So to your question about it is not only a postal exchange, it's also making those pieces of jewelry as gifts, but also with an anti-colonial understanding of what reparation is. And here you see Horia Boutelja, another interlocutor in the book, to whom I offered this necklace that I prepared, copying the model of the oldest Algerian necklace that is still held by Quai in Paris, because it was plundered from Algeria in the 19th century. And when I offered it to Horia Boutelja, it was with the promise that the day that we will liberate this necklace from Quai we will cast it in gold. So this is somehow something about my embodied way to inhabit this destroyed world.
Thank you so much for that incredible response. I'm going to ask Alexandra now to please read letter number 2 and letter number 3 simultaneously so that we can hold just a sense of what it is that you are writing to Ariella in your correspondence.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So my second question, dear Ariella Aïsha, I'm delighted to have been given this opportunity to address you, and thank you again, Nantumiso, and was intrigued to read about how you chose your addressees. You write that you only address those with whom you share a certain commitment to pursue the anti-imperial struggle of your ancestors, and explain why you exclude others, such as Adolphe Crémieux, whose destructive influence is acknowledged. Are there any worthy addressees that you haven't included in the jewelers? And by the way, I note that the role of addressee can be claimed for oneself and not only bestowed by the letter writer, as for example, Achille Mbembe did with your letter to Sylvia Winter. And my final letter question says, I am writing this not from my native Thessaloniki, once described as the Jerusalem of the Balkans, but from a North London suburb where I have settled as a knowledge economy migrant. I grew up mindful of Thessaloniki's rich historical hybridity and its subsequent destruction. In the mid-90s, my father, Xenophon Kokoli, translated into modern Greek a collection of Sephardic songs by Jewish refugees from Spain, and commissioned Savina Giannatu to record them. Savina has since performed them many times, often with the ensemble Primavera and Salonico, to great international acclaim. And yet here I am writing to you in English, and we're conducting all this in English as well, on a laptop that belongs to my employer, and where I never bothered installing a Greek keyboard. Even adding the requisite diaeresis over the I in your middle name takes a few steps. How can we resist monolingualism and the gravitational pull of Latin keyboards in daily life with their tempting shortcuts and apparent simplicity? Can you please share your strategies? Yours, Alexandra.
Thank you, Alexandra, again for these beautiful questions. I start, with an anecdote, just, to echo what you said. My computer crashed a few weeks ago, and I had to work on a new computer owned also by the institution where I'm working, Brown University. And I cannot renounce on installing keyboards. I have to install, at least 3 keyboards, the French, the Hebrew, and the Arabic. And while going to install the Hebrew, I was really revolted. I was about not to install it because I was so outraged, because now they market the Hebrew keyboard. They market, when you just download it with the Israeli flag, as if Hebrew belongs to Israel, as if Hebrew doesn't have a very, very rich and diverse history in Africa, in Asia, in America, in Europe, fonts that were used by the Jews to speak in so many languages. Because what happened is, prior to the fusion between colonial projects and nationalism, which is another, step in this whole world that we inhabit, is prior to that, for Jews all over the world, it was clear that they know to write Hebrew fonts, but they don't necessarily know Hebrew, because they wrote Arabic with Hebrew font. They wrote Yiddish with Hebrew font, because this kind of collapse of the written, the read, and the spoken is a colonial terror that tells people which languages they have to speak and how they have to speak them. So not only they destroyed Ladino, that you mentioned, not only they destroyed Yiddish and all the Judeo-Arabic or Judeo-Darija, they also destroyed the way that people for, thousands of years used different, typographies to write different languages, which made all these languages to exist in a kind of plural world. world that was organized along trade routes rather than in between borders of 200 nation states that the end of World War II managed through the UN and other international horrible organizations like the World Bank, like the IMF, and with a lot of different types of violence, actually to dissect the world into this monolinguism of the understanding of our identities, not only of our languages. So you're asking a big question. What are my strategies? You know, I share strategies with all people who inherited this anti-colonial drive, who inherited anti-colonial drive as the way that they inhabit the world. So rather than speaking about my strategies, what I'm trying to do in the book is exactly to enter in dialogue with all my interlocutors about their strategies, how to struggle against this monolinguism. So I'll just give an example, you know, from one of the letters that also I mentioned earlier that the letter to Samira Negrush was not planned. There was another letter that was not planned. I was spending one semester at American Academy in Berlin in a beautiful place on the Wannsee Lake, and I was haunted by the Wannsee Conference building, where in 1942 they decided upon the final solution for the Jews. How to exterminate the Jews, and actually not how to exterminate, how to achieve a consensus that the Jews should be exterminated. So I was, you know, facing this, you know, beautiful lake, but on the other side of the lake was this, you know, a villa where in 3 minutes they decided upon the extermination of the Jews. And this brought to my mind 3 lines in an interview that I did with my father. I did one interview with my father many, many years ago when he turned, now I cannot recall if it was 65 or 75, but I felt this urge that was tied to the fact that he lost his voice because he had cancer in his vocal cords. And I felt a responsibility to collect his stories that I heard several times, but for my children and the children of my sisters. And when I was facing the Wannsee Conference building, I was reminded that my father told me something about that our family was sent to Auschwitz. And it didn't go with my memories because we were from Algeria. How come that we were sent to Auschwitz? There were plans after they put the Jews, including my father, in concentration camps in North Africa to send them to Auschwitz. But Algeria, Morocco, North Africa were the first defeat of the Nazi in 1942. And I'll not get into the details. Anyhow, so I went back to these 3 lines and started to dig, and part of my family, my father's aunt, her husband, and the 4 children left Algeria in the 1930s to France because, you know, as colonized, France offered some better opportunities, and France always wanted the colonized to come to work for its capital, for its racial capital. So they left to Paris, and in 1942 they were deported to Auschwitz. So I started to dig and to get more information about these stories, not having any other oral history or no one else to ask questions. So I had to dig the very meager, you know, colonial documents in the archive. And I realized that the other son of my great-grandmother, Julie Bomendil, who is my grandfather, Joseph Azoulay, he deserted the French army during World War I. So when you open history books about Jews in Algeria, you will read that enthusiastically, they wanted to die for France. Bullshit. My grandfather deserted the army. 4 months he hid himself, and another 4 months he spent in prison as a punishment. And then his mother made everything possible to say that he is necessary at home, and he was liberated after 4 months. So his mother, whom I never met, Julie Bomendil, is actually my discovered anti-colonial mother. She raised in her house of a single woman. She was a cleaner. She was a cleaner. I don't know whose houses she cleaned, but I'm assuming that she cleaned French houses, French settlers' houses. But this is how she's described in the archive. She was a cleaner. She had 3 children. One of them died after 2 years. One of them was deported to Auschwitz with her family, and the third one, who is my grandfather, deserted the army. He was an anarchist. He was the vice president of the anarchist union of the butchers, and practicing butchery. That at the beginning I was a little bit, oh no, I don't want to study what does it mean butchery. But butchery is an artisanal labor. And not only it is an artisanal labor, because of the affinities between Jewish and Muslims, rules about, slaughters of animals and culinary restrictions, this was an occupation that was not in the French administration, like history books would like to tell that all the Jews wanted to be French. This was an occupation, a craft occupation, to cater both communities. So answering your question, in a kind of very windy way, is I discovered, another interlocutor that was not planned in the book. And maybe just to end my question with image, because I really like to speak with images.
And while you find that exact image, while you're pulling it up for us, Ariella, I also just want to hold the sense of speaking about strategies and how important your book is in terms of not only trying to create more strategies, because even the writing itself is not only talking about the strategy of art making, not art as an imperial project, and then trying to work with artisanal and craft practices to really confront that kind of imperial work of art making as something that creates identities. The strategies that you're also exploring beyond the letter writing and the jewelry making individually, but then also working in collectives with people creating their own jewels. The kind of strategies that you're talking about are really enlivening in the ways that you're opening us up to thinking about how we can actualize the need to know where we come from and to know beyond the history with a capital H that we have been given. And I think that Jennifer's questions coming up are also related to strategies of anti-colonial work in very particular ways. So I'm going to ask now if you found your image, and then
thank you so much for this generous, comment. And I found it, and I will be happy to share
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Anandissimo. Really, I appreciate. So just, wanted to close with, 2 images, looking for my grandmother, whom I never saw, I never met, I never heard her name, I think, when my father was still alive. Sent me immediately to those colonial, postcards. Despite their coloniality, how can I still, interact with them as my interlocutors, as my unknown grandmother? So I wanted to share this image of, several women who were also some of them were also cleaners. Some of them were sent to colonial schools of weaving. And when they failed the school, and calling it school is just repeating a colonial category. These were actually sweatshops. when they failed to do what they were expected to do there, they were sent to clean houses. So this was for me a way not being left with no image whatsoever of how my great grandmother looked like. And this is another image maybe I would like to share very briefly. Here what I try to do is to look at my Algerian, ancestors that are not biologically mine, but images of my Algerian ancestors in which I recognize the face of my father. My father, you would see him here, and you would see him here in a kind of more retouched image, as a soldier in the French army during World War II. He went to a photographer's studio and see how his face was whitened, how he, even in the printed copy that I have, his cheeks were colored with rose. And Mesali Haj, that you see him here on the left side, in whom I recognize the face of my father, would be my interlocutor that is not included in the book. I felt that I needed another 3 years to get to delve into all his writings and activities in order to be able to address him. So, yeah.
Incredible.
Thank you for those generative questions and comments.
Thank you, Alexandra. That's for you. And we do have some questions that are coming into our webinar chat. Thank you so much for starting us off with those. We will come to those toward the end. So please, as we continue with this correspondence, do write in your correspondence so we can talk together at the end of this. Going to come to Jennifer Bajorek's correspondence next. And Jennifer, I'd like to invite you to tell me if you'd like to read yours or if you'd like me to read them for you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes.
Absolutely.
I will read myself, and I will try to go quickly, although not too quickly, but I'll try to be efficient. Thank you, all of you, for being here, and thank you, Nondumeso, for the organizing, and Ariella, most of all, for this work. And there may be some overlap with what Alexandra has shared, and I hope that will be generative and give you opportunities to expand. So, Ariella, I was struck while reading your recent work how important sound is, including but not limited to the sound of certain spoken languages, to the project of unlearning imperialism. Some moments that come to mind are your voicing of the name Aïsha. In Potential History, you write eloquently about your memory of your father's North African accent while speaking French, which betrays a hidden history of speaking Arabic with his mother. In La Résistance des Bijoux, you reference his Darija, La Judeo-Darija. You also write about your feeling of bereftness at not inheriting Ladino from your mother. So the first question, and I ask it in a slightly different way again, can you elaborate on your understanding of sound, song, voice, the sonic, the oral A-U-R-A-L, the oral O-R-A-L strategies and methods, whether in Potential History, La Résistance des Bijoux, or in the Jewelers of the Ummah? And just a qualifying way of asking again, I think it's clear that your interest in sound includes language and polyglossia, but also clearly extends beyond language in the conventional sense, to implicate what you call in La Résistance des Bijoux, the anti-colonial sensorium. And I'm thinking here in that other book, which has a relation, of course, to this latest, of the sound of the music of the necklace you are making at the close of the book. So another way, perhaps, of asking the same question would be, why is it important that we activate this sensorium, or how can we activate this sensorium in our research?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, for this beautiful question. It has, multi-layered, it is a multi-layered question, so I will try slowly to address it. So, colonial projects have their own soundtrack. There is now a beautiful film that just came out by Juan Grimo Pérez, soundtrack for a coup d'etat, about the assassination of Lumumba by the same UN that I mentioned earlier, the Belgian, the American, etc. But colonialism as its soundtrack. So before responding to how do I engage with sound or sonority, I would like to speak about how we are being sound to the colonizers. And I would like to share an image, if you don't mind. Again, just let me put it on a full screen so I'll be able to, I will be able to manipulate it. So obviously the colonized always hear how the colonizers speak about them. And I'm thinking about, the French colonization of Algeria. In 1870, the colonizers wanted to, their project was dying in a certain way. The revolts were so intense that their project was dying if they will not have more Europeans. So what they did, there was a delineated group that they delineated, but spread all over Algeria, of 40,000 Jews. And from one day to the next, with a document, imperial document, signed by Adolphe Crémier that Alexandra mentioned earlier, they forced all the Jews to stop being Algerian and becoming French citizens in their own colonized country. And they called it, okay, your case is resolved. Now you are French. No colonized demands from now on. And this is what I'm trying to break. This spell is what I'm trying to break in this book, because we have many demands facing Europe about being colonized in North Africa, being colonized and exterminated in Europe, but being forced actually to destroy Palestine because the UN decided that the Zionist represents all the Jews around the world and are mandated to destroy Palestine and to evacuate the Jews from the Jewish Muslim world. So when the Jews in 1870 were made citizens against their will, except a few that always wanted to collaborate with the colonial regime, nothing surprising about this, but not the 40,000 Jews who were made French citizens, the Jews started to hear a lot of anti-Semitic, saying in Algeria where there were none, because it is an European project, anti-Semitism. So once the Jews became citizens, they stopped hearing the general racism. They started to hear a particular type of racism, which is against Jews. So this is the soundtrack that the Algerian colonized heard in Algeria. But when I started this research, I had to read many of the colonizers, the settlers, scholarship, right? Not only scholarship, there are scientific oeuvres. So I read, one French settler who became psychiatrist while in Algeria, and he wrote about the psychosis of the Jews. And he got access, to the psychiatric hospital where Jews were confined for different reasons. Some of them were probably, suffered from some mental health issue, but many of them were sent there because the way that they sounded to the colonizers didn't work. They had to be punished. And one of the cases that I read was about, there was a dying child, and the mother and the family called all the neighbors, and they had their ululations, they had all their jewellery-making noises, like I am making. And this seems to him really one of the psychoses of the Jews. So what I'm trying to do is, looking, for example, at this, colonial photograph by Jean Besancenot and bringing myself into it to sound with them like the sound that the colonizers wanted to deprive us from. And as much as I do this sound, I am happy. Because this is exactly the sound that we had to remove from ourselves in order to pass as the colonizers expected from us. So thank you, Jennifer, for bringing this question, because it has really many, many aspects. You saw earlier the table around which I invite many others to make their jewelry. They are taking their jewelry home. They are taking the stories of others. We exchange narration and fabrication. And around this table, I filmed the last part of my cinematic trilogy, Unlearning Imperial Plunder. The first one was undocumented, about how actually all those asylum seekers, they have their rights in Europe, in the museums where their objects were plundered, and they still held by those museums. The second one was the world like a jewel in the hand, trying to connect the colonization of Algeria with the colonization of Palestine. And the third one is 1001 Jewel, and it's around the table mostly, and I film the stories that people narrate around the table that are related to the jewelry. And I'll come back to it later when we'll talk about sovereignty. I think it's in one of our questions on our plate. But here you see Nadia Amour, with whom I collaborated already in the previous film. And here around the table, she sings. She's a singer. She's an Amazigh singer, an Algerian Amazigh singer, Kabyle. And here what you see is, some of the signs, the Amazigh signs on her bandir, which is kind of a drum that you hold in the hand, and she sings with it around the table. And this is another image of three Jewish, Algerian, Moroccan, and Tunisian women that I filmed as the last scene of the film. They are singing a prayer, a Jewish prayer called Nidrei, that was considered to be the sign that the Jews are unreliable in Europe, and the Jews were not allowed to sing it, to pray it in Germany and in France in the 19th century. So here we take the liberty of women wearing the prayer shawl, and they are singing this prayer. And I wanted to go back, to your question, to the civil contract of photography, which was actually the first time that I articulated a political ontology of photography. And in this political ontology of photography, I insist on the fact that we are not viewing photographs, we have to watch them. And watching photographs means listening to photographs, because we cannot stay only on the visuality of the photograph. We cannot stay only within the frame, which is the product, the outcome of the event of photography. We have to go beyond, before and after, what was captured in visuality, and we were deprived of it. So just, I thought about this image, but, in any image, but here it is visually clear that in this image, when the Zionists conquered Nazareth after they evacuated thousands of Palestinians already from Nazareth, as you know, there was a small group in comparison to the number of Palestinians who were in Palestine that were stayed in destroyed Palestine when Israel put its borders around it. And one of the places in the north is Nazareth. And here, this image, what I love about it is that she doesn't accept the authority of the soldier. Not only she doesn't accept the authority of the soldier, all Palestinians until today, they don't accept it. But here, this is a moment where we see that the soldier himself doesn't know yet how to inhabit the position of the ultimate perpetrator. So there is a moment of conversation between them, while it could end that he will take his rifle and will kill her like they killed so many Palestinians. So listening to those images, trying to speculate on what we are looking at was always part of my understanding of the civil contract of photography, which was never about those precious images held or plundered by museums. So maybe I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariella. Do I have time to read one more question? May I read one more? Yes? Okay. So I'm going to skip, because you've already beautifully answered, Ariella, I think my second question, which was more explicitly about sound and photography. This is about photography and some of the photographs we've just seen, right, would bring us right to this question. So how might your practice or practices with regard to the photographs you've included in your recent publications, and I'm thinking here of both the books on jewelry, if that's an adequate description, but I'm really thinking about the photographs of the jewelry. How might these practices be considered methods of activating or accessing non-imperial accounts of imperial violence precisely with and through photographs? And here I'm really interested to hear you speak to certain decisions, if you're willing, that you've made with regard to the images in these recent books. I'm just really struck by the practice. Your practice is always evolving vis-a-vis photography, but this seems to me a quite distinctive moment. Some of these images you've just shown could be seen as illustration. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again, Jennifer, for this question. So with your permission, I will share my screen again. Just going back for a second, as you already noticed and mentioned, I'm not only looking at photographs as a spectator or as watching them, but I'm also intervening in the photographs and retake photographs. And this is a photograph that I had to take because it was not there. These women were shown to me as if they were kind of hangers for the colonial photographer to take photographs of my ancestors' jewelry. And the women were there just, as hangers on which you put jewelry, and he took photographs and took them to France and made his glory. So this photograph had to be taken because they do not belong to the past. We share the space. We share the 500 years of colonial violence, I think, that was not brought into closure. So each and every image where I'm reading with scissors, with another camera, with different other means, is for me a way of a small step into unlearning, but in a more physical way that leave opportunities for others to continue to intervene. That is about sharing methodologies. It is about not letting images stay forever under their colonial violence, only under their colonial violence. It doesn't mean to erase colonial violence, but to transform the way that my students, for example, will go to the archive and they will not encounter, the images of 2,000 women that Marc Granger, another French soldier who was in Algeria during the destruction of the housing of 2 million Algerians and putting them in concentration camps, or what the French called euphemistically camp de regroupement, regroupment camps. So he was a soldier and he had a good camera, and he took portraits of 2,000 Algerian women that his officer told him they had to unveil. So I don't want my students only to encounter those very beautiful portraits of Algerian women unveiled. What I did is starting to look at these images and listening to these women. What did they do? And how come that in all of them, they are so beautiful with all of their jewelry? So they were forced to unveil, but actually they came empowered with their jewelry. And metals are very protective. Silver especially is considered very protective, and they all came with their jewelry when they were forced to be taken in those photographs. So I don't repeat the full image. What I'm doing is looking at their jewelry and trying to let those photographs exist also under a different form what they did when they came to the violent encounter with their colonizers, what they brought, and looking at their images. What we see here, we have already talked about the coins and necklaces made out of coins, but you see here also the key. And the key is very important, not only for the symbolic of the key, because what we see here is that women participated in jewelry making. So when you study about jewelers in Algeria, you hear only about men, but they participated in the life of their necklaces, in the life of their jewels, because jewels is not just something that you bought in a store. They went to the jeweler, or the jeweler came to their house. There were many exchanges. So the exchanges that I'm trying to create around this narration fabrication, and narration is also about sound, are encounters that reproduce not only the pieces of jewelry, but reproduce those encounters between Jews and Muslims, but not in this kind of fixated, relationship that the Jews are the jewelers and the Muslims are those who are wearing the jewelers, but in a kind of sharing our heritage and trying to understand also the role of women in the preservation of their jewelry. And around the table, what I'm sharing is not only material for making jewelry, but also images of our ancestors. So it's not only, again, and I like always to speak, in concert with others, it's not only about me and what I'm doing. Once, these women around the table, there are some men also sometimes, they are getting to hold these images of women, their ancestors, or with the jewelry, they are being reminded of pieces of jewelry that they inherited or not, or that they heard about it. And they are looking at these images, and there are dialogues that are starting to be, to unfold around the table. So photographs are, once we refuse from an anti-colonial perspective to accept them as the product that the colonizers did, and we have to respect the limits, they have also an entire sensorium in which we participate, rather than just consuming them from the outside and respecting the white settler genealogies of who was the first photographer in here or there, and which kind of studio they had, and which kind of devices they had, and how beautiful their images. No, it's part of our shared reclamation of what was left of the worlds that were destroyed, and how we participate in not letting it be only remains in museums, but part of who we are. So maybe I'll stop here. Thank you.
I'll say thank you again for those responses. And I'm going to ask Jennifer to please read the rest of your questions, if you would like to.
I don't need to. I think it's better to pass the mic to the next.
Fantastic. Also mic shy, Jennifer. Now I'm going to read through Professor Emery Kalema's questions, but in his absence, Ariella, I am also happy for us to respond to the questions a little bit briefly, so that we can then also create another space, hopefully, to be able to sit with these kinds of questions in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to open up Emery's questions. And Emery writes, Ariella, thank you for your work. Your work reimagines the archive and memory through the epistolary form, unsettling the linear temporal frameworks that colonial modernity has imposed. He asks, how does this disruption of the past as a fixed category open up the possibility of reanimating a conviviality obliterated by imperialism? And the second part of this question says, could this act of inhabiting the debris of a shared world also be seen as a gesture toward a new ethics of memory, one that resists the boundaries of nation, identity, and imperial classifications? Ariella.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll try to be very brief, and I'll try to And thank you, Professor Emery Kalema, for the question. I'll try to be brief because, part of, I think, what is in the question, I've already replied in different ways, but I would like to dwell for a second on the notion of the past that is in the question with quotation mark and the importance of putting it in quotation mark because the past is an imperial invention. The past doesn't exist. The past exists only because imperialism created institutions that tell us that the past is separated from the present and the future, that we are speaking about three separated tenses, like, in echo, I think, with what I said earlier about languages, the three, dimensions of the spoken, the heard, the spoken, the written, and the spoken, the written, and the read that were collapsed in or synthesized into, homogeneous languages with the separation, the dissection of time into three temporalities. It was not in order to leave the past as entangled with the present and the future as, we experience time in our life, not as separated, but it was in order to create a sequence, a particular sequence of progress. So everything that was declared past cannot be, we cannot return to it. We cannot reclaim it. We cannot inhabit it. We have to study it from the outside. And I think that, what I'm trying to do through, those different, paths that I'm taking and always together with others is refuting this disruption that the dissection of the past from our embodied experience imposed and materialized in our world in the form of museums, archives, etc., where we are invited to encounter this past as if it really exists as a separated tenth. So yes, it creates a different ethics of memory, and it makes memory to be living memory, embodied memory, that as descendants, we can have very living memories of our ancestors, of the memories of our ancestors, without turning them into our objects of study, rather continuing with them the anti-colonial, never-ending struggle to decolonize the world.
The second question that Emery writes is around how the book, The Jewelers of the Ummah, A Potential History of the Jewish Muslim World, situates objects, jewelry, crafts, artifacts, as sites of resistance. And I think from Jennifer's questions and Alexandra's questions before around strategies, objects also begins to open up, and we start to speak about the sounds of those objects and the different kinds of reverberations of sites of resistance. So in the book, in situating these sites of resistance and bearers of a pre-colonial world's social and spiritual order, in tracing the political and ethical infrastructures embedded in these objects and their resonances, how do you conceive of sovereignty beyond the colonial nation-state framework? And could the artisan's material creations, and I think even the resonant creations and intergenerational knowledge, offer a model for rethinking communal belonging and justice in ways that defy the extractive logics of empire?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And the answer is yes. Yes, intergenerational knowledge, multi-generational knowledge is the only answer that we have for the extractive, imperialism, extractive racial capitalism that we see all over the world. And I will try to reply, with an example. We just have to think about mines. There are so many hollow mountains today in the world. Why there are so many hollow mountains around the world? Because extractive capitalism, emptied them of all their minerals. But how come that there were no so many empty, hollowed mountains earlier? Because the craftspeople, those who transmitted intergenerationally this knowledge of making jewelry, for example, transmitted not only the knowledge of how to make this piece of jewelry or another, it was also a knowledge about these metals. It was also knowledge how and how much we can mine the mountain in order not to hollow the mountain. They transmitted not only the know-how, but they transmitted what should not be done. Interdictions, prohibitions, this is what they transmitted. And the reason that the French colonization of Algeria started by the destruction of the artisanal hub of Algeria, that was, part of the Ottoman Empire, part of a very large, trade and circulation of resistance, not only of know-how. The reason they destroy it is in order to destroy this kind of knowledge of resistance, this kind of interdictions, what should not be done, and also the corporations in which the workers were organized in order that when they say no, it was the no of their community, of other artisans, but all the centuries of their ancestors who were artisans. So yes, we have to reclaim all this knowledge, and we have to refuse to accept that this was made into past, and today there is AI who will solve all our problem. AI, we have to say a big no. If we add the power of our ancestors, it would not even be a question that we have categorically to say no to AI, because AI, it's not only a very speedy killing machine, as we saw in Gaza. The fact that Israel was managed to assassinate so many Palestinians is first of all because of the money and the arms that came from the entire West, who are invested in keeping this genocidal regime in place, but also because of the AI that enabled the acceleration of the genocide to a scale that is really unbelievably fast. So yes, no to AI that make all of us indispensable, because the world can be run by AI and those horrible people who invented what should not have been invented. So yes, hands together, reminded of the knowledge of our ancestors to say no and to save the world from its progressive destruction.
Thank you. I'm reminded as you're speaking that refusal as a concept for thinking is an indigenous concept, is about indigenous communities holding their hands together and refusing that their ways of life be destroyed, refusing that the ways in which they make knowledge, that we make knowledge, be destroyed. And I found it really exciting that your answer to this question was yes. So I want to repeat the question again, because I think it's what I was mentioning earlier about how this book offers a model for rethinking. And so Emery asked, could the artisans' material creations and intergenerational knowledge offer a model for rethinking communal belonging and justice in ways that defy the extractive logics of empire? And your answer was yes. And I think that this book is that yes, is one of the models for rethinking, and doing so through an indigenous paradigm, which is incredibly exciting as an anti-colonial gesture. Emery's last question is, in your letter to Fanon, you reflect on the colonial trauma of Algerian Jews. You underscore their alienation within overlapping regimes of colonial and racial subjection. He asks, how might Fanon's conceptual framework, rooted in the experience of the colonized subject, be reimagined to account for the layered contradictions faced by those who inhabit a space of dual erasure, such as Jewish Algerians? He continues to ask, how could this reconfiguration of Fanon's thought help us articulate a broader, more inclusive anti-colonial project that resists both imperial amnesia and the exclusions of nationalist paradigms?
Yeah, so thank you for for this last question. I would like to say two things. As for what I'm saying about Fanon, I invite the audience to read the letter to Fanon. It's in the book. But I would like to reply to the second part of the question about this, could this reconfiguration of Fanon's thought, how can it help us today? And I would like to reply, in a broader sense, not only through the letter to Fanon. What I mentioned earlier about forcing the Jews to become citizens, the colonized Jews in Algeria to become citizens in 1870, actually was a way for the colonizers to solve, with quotation mark, the Jewish problem that they brought from Europe. To solve their problem of, dying colonialism that could have died earlier, because all of a sudden they had more 40,000, people who they could say are Europeans. And we know that colonial projects survive only with bodies that are being considered part of the colonial power. And when in 1962, Algerians dismantled the colonial regime, when the Jews had to leave Algeria, it was a closed deal. Most of them went to France, they became French citizens, and the demand toward them that came in the wake of the French Revolution in the 18th century to forget who they are, to forget that they were Jews, and in the public sphere to be citizens, this kind of horrible, imperial projects of making people to be not who they were, not to resemble to their ancestors, but to become citizens. All these, colonial projects with soft means, like citizenship, like the emancipation in the 18th century, like assimilation, and the destruction of languages, made it that the voices of the Jews were not heard. And they were not heard for the second time in a very dramatic way in 1945, when the extermination of the Jews by Europe, not only the Nazi regime, by Europe, the French sent to extermination 75,000 Jews from France. The Jews stayed in displaced person camps from 45 to 48 because they were undesired anywhere in Europe or in the US. And the Zionists came every day to tell them, you don't have any other choice than to come to colonize Palestine with us. And as part of the New World Order and the invention of the UN during World War II, came the assassination of Lumumba, came the destruction of Palestine, and came the idea that Europe is not responsible for its crimes to the Jews, and the Jews have nothing to demand toward Europe, because the Jews, this is how it was imposed, received the country, received Palestine. But it was not the Jews, it was the Zionists that forced the Jews all over the world to be identified with the Zionist colonial project. So for me, making this work is to reinscribe the Jews in the history of colonization, in the history of being colonized, in order to reintegrate the Jews into the project of global decolonization. Because when we know today what are the brutal tactics to deport people because they support Palestine, to deport people because they criticized genocide, to fire them from work, they are using this same identification between Zionists that could be evangelical and could be the entire West, because the entire West is Zionist, support the Zionist project, and to conflate it with the Jews. So the labor of this work is to reinscribe the Jews in the history of colonization in order to reinscribe us in the global project of decolonization. It's a project of Black people, it's a project of indigenous people, it's a project of all the other places that were colonized. And I think that the reintegration of the Jews, not the Zionists, within this vision of the urgency to decolonize the world is key. So this is why the label vis-a-vis Fanon, who is the father of our anti-colonial discourse, and it matters that we will read Fanon with this understanding that if he was still with us, I'm sure that he will understand his mistake that he didn't consider the Jews, the colonized Jews in Algeria, to be colonized, and he treated them as European citizens. So sorry for the long answer, but I couldn't make it in a shorter one.
Ariella, I am going to shift the tenor of our conversation just a little bit, particularly because, as I mentioned to you, I myself am invested in this kind of work and invested in it very strongly from the space of embodiment or working with embodied knowledges, muscular memory, as you refer to it. And I was really interested in the act of letter writing and the ways in which you have engaged in this act over time, because one of the things that gets lost as well when we talk about a particular volume is the sense that the practice you are in is one that you are committed to over time beyond the monograph or whatever it might be, that then collates the kind of work that you're doing. And one of the things that I found particularly exciting about how you were talking about writing through open letters is that you said in an interview that you're not writing to everybody. And Alexandra intimated this earlier as well. Part of what I find exciting about not writing to everybody is that the direct address of the letter allows you to work through inhabiting emotion with its clear cultural politics. And you are able to write expletives, you are able to write challenges, you are able to write doubt of your own thoughts into the work as well. And that's something that is not generally made space for in academic writing with its authoritative tones. And so I want to ask you a question about the different kind of inhabitants, to kind of refer to Sarah Ahmed as well, the different kind of inhabitants that you are creating with the practice of letter writing. Because apart from this, I also saw a letter to Achille Mbembe that you wrote somewhere along the journey of producing the letters that make up this book. Can you tell me a little bit, and tell us, please, a little bit about that, this different kind of inhabitants that you are able to enter into by the act of writing letters?
Yeah, thank you, Nodif Misu, for this wonderful question that brings me to the origin, I would say, even of the project, without knowing that it is the origin in a certain way. But I think that, you know, when my mother passed away, it was, I think, 12 or 13 years ago, I didn't write an obituary. I wrote her a letter. I didn't think about, writing a book of letters. I didn't think that this is actually what I want to do. But I wrote her a letter because 20 years earlier, almost 20 years earlier, I cannot recall now exactly, I wrote the first in a series of rewriting of a text that I called it at the beginning Mother Tongue, Father Tongue, and came out in the Boston Review 2-3 years ago, and K is the first essay in La Résistance des Bijoux in French, and I called it Settler Colonial Tongue. And this practice of rewriting and this practice of, writing to my mother a letter that I could not actually talk with her when she was alive, because imperialism shaped our relationship. So this practice of rewriting, revisiting, is a practice that enabled, I think, to move in the way that we engage with others. So as you quoted me earlier, that I'm not writing to everybody, it has a second part, this sentence. I'm not writing to everybody and to nobody, because, texts that we write, in academic formats are to nobody or to everybody. So I insist on these two sides of the equation, but writing these kind of open letters, I address them to someone in particular, but I invite all of you to participate in this epistolary space, but as people who sign their letters. And when I told you, when you invited me to present my work today, I told you, listen, online, I'm not giving lectures. Online, only conversations. And I expected to get a list of questions, and I received a series of letters. I didn't ask any of you to write me letters, and you wrote me letters. I think that there is something about the epistolary space that create a space for others to join, to go in other directions, to write other letters, to understand that actually not only AI will not make us indispensable, superfluous to the world, we can sign what we are saying when we address someone else. Because academic texts, we sign them, but we sign them as academic personas. But we are trying to create a different exchange on the premises of a long anti-colonial struggle that we want to engage with when we are continuing to write those letters and creating those spaces in which there are no only ideas. We are not sharing only ideas or exchanging only ideas. We are also performing who we are. So if I can, bring something from the letter that I write to Hannah Arendt. So the letter to Hannah Arendt, I wrote about Hannah Arendt so much. It's not something that I didn't do, but I never, addressed her. And I challenge her about, relating to Jews like me, like the Orientals. We were the Orientals Jews. They look like Arab, but they speak Hebrew. She couldn't understand who we are. Okay, but I'm not making a big fuss out of it. I speak about it. But I love Hannah Arendt. She was my safety belt while I was living in the Zionist colony in Palestine. And because she had many, many, many conceptual, articulations of amazing ideas in her book. And I do with them what I do with photography. I use them in my own trajectory. And one of them is the distinction that she makes between what we are and who we are. And I think that in the academic writing, it's what we are. We are a great scholar of this. We are great experts of this. When we engage in this epistolary space, it's who we are, because the others see us in a different way, not just as an academic scholar with whom we argue. So it creates an epistolary space that we can really arrive to different, areas or different wounds that otherwise I don't think that we can even start to understand how to heal them with others in community. So I think that one of the questions that finally was not fully articulated here, that I read it, or maybe I read a version and you read it, was about sovereignty. I think that we are performing worldly sovereignty by insisting that we are not just citizens of empires, but we have other fabrics in which we are woven with others, and we are rehearsing our power together to say many no's that we still have to.
Many, many no's. I'm going to ask one more question and then invite a response to the questions that are being written in the chat box from our guests. And I'm trying to choose which of the questions that I have going to ask, because I'm sure you saw when we began, I started off quite nervously because this is such an important and massive project. And I am quite honored to be challenged by your thinking. And I'm going to share from your letter to Fanon, which we have shared with all of our guests. And we do please invite you to have a read of that excerpt from the book. From letter 4 to Frantz Fanon, you write, "With all my being, I refuse to accept this amputation. Dear Frantz, I'm neither a psychiatrist nor a psychoanalyst, but I can say with confidence that my father suffered from colonial trauma and a colonial disorder. He felt foreign to his environment, totally alienated, and even though this kind of disorder must have been very common among Algerian Jews, there was nowhere he could go to take advantage of what you describe as the medical technique that aims to enable man no longer to be a stranger to his environment. No therapeutic or psychiatric initiative in Algeria offered Algerian Jews a way to recognize or articulate their colonial disorder. They suffered from their colonial subjection as indigenous Algerians, their transformation into French citizens in 1870, the revocation of their French citizenship under Vichy, the anti-Jewish laws in the Maghreb, and the restoration of French citizenship after World War II. And I share this to say there is something in the demand for reparations that refuses this amputation, that also demands that Fanon consider how his imperial learning allowed Fanon to leave your father for amputation. You imagine that Fanon could have helped your father, and as you write to Fanon, you say that Fanon could have helped stop your father's amputation. As Fanon was both a man of medicine and anti-colonialist, but Fanon's imperial learning made him see a white man, part of the colonizing race. You argue for Fanon to see that his commitment to Arabs in Algeria should also have extended his hand to people like your father, not only Muslims, but Muslim Jews too. In that, Fanon is asked to reckon with his separatism. And I don't seem to have a question here, Ariella, but I'm asking for your response. I continue by referring to Chabani Mangani, who, on living in South Africa's separatist regime, apartheid, wrote that the progressive denial and fear of the body results in a psychological amputation. I'm interested in how your practice of making jewelry as an act of a different kind of inhabitants may have allowed you a way of confronting this. And I'm also aware of what Alia Al-Saji calls the disabling duration of colonialism's temporality, or what she says is a debilitating colonial duration, that colonial disorders are not only individual pathologies, as you quote Fanon. I'm asking how the artisan's practice can be seen as a return after separation.
Yeah, thank you, Dumiso, for this beautiful question again. I mean, there is so much to think with, and I wonder from where to start, but I cannot avoid, starting from the first part of the question about Fanon, and then maybe going back to the question of about craft. I know that you said that there is no question in relation to Fanon, but you want me to respond, so I want to respond. I'm thinking about Fanon worked, in the clinic for a certain time before he joined the revolution, the Algerian Revolution. And, his two close assistants were Jews, Algerian Jews. And he didn't see them as Algerian Jews. He saw them as his peers. They were psychiatrists, or they made their stage in psychiatry. I was thinking about Alice Sharkey, about Azoulay. And they spoke excellent French because they went to Republican schools in Algeria. They also spoke other languages, but they spoke an amazing French language, like Fanon himself. And I'm thinking about, Fanon and Azoulay roaming around in Algeria and going to see which kind of practices the Muslims have. And Jacques Azoulay, who is himself an Algerian, himself has some remains of at least muscular memory from home of these practices. He goes like an anthropologist in Algeria to look at them. And how come that this happens to Fanon, who is an anti-colonial, psychiatrist, anti-colonial thinker, etc., etc. Is Fanon didn't develop his anti-colonial thinking as a Martiniquais who was colonized by France. And this is why he could not see in Azoulay and Cherki, Azoulay nothing to do, by the way, with my family, Azoulay and Cherki could not see in them also colonized. They were thinking about how to help Algerians, as if the two of them were not Algerians, right? So this is part of the syndrome. This is part of the blindness. But I'm not blaming Fanon for that because, we have so many blind spots. We just have to acknowledge that we were born into imperial world, so we have to unlearn. And about the Jews, Fanon didn't unlearn.
Yes, and I'm going to pause there, Ariella, with apologies for interrupting, but I would like to just come to some of the questions that are in our chat box before our time runs out.
Yes, sure. But I cannot read them now as we are talking. If those who read them can read them, or if you can read them.
I'll read them out. Safed Hadzi Muhammadovich says, I'm sure that you have encountered critics saying that you need to take the rose-tinted glasses off and see that Muslim-Jewish relations were fraught with problems. I wonder, how do you reply to these voices? The one saying there was no convivencia and so on. I also wonder how, beyond this jewelry craft, you have rediscovered and perhaps recovered shared spaces and temporalities from everyday neighborly relations to religious exchanges. Finally, if it is of no small importance that Christians have always been neighbors in the world you describe, is Jewish-Muslim world then a Christian world as well? And please reply to just one if you have time.
Yeah, I'll try to be very brief. So yes, of course, this world was fraught with problems. We know any human relationship that is not fraught with problems? Obviously not. So why wouldn't the Jewish-Muslim world will not be fraught with problems? Does it justify any of those problems or even moments of violence? Did they justify the total destruction of this world and the creation of this invented Judeo-Christian tradition with all its nation states that are a machine of generating violent problems and violent genocides? I think that the answer is implied already in the way that I try to reply to those who challenge me with this, with a question about Christians. In North Africa, which is the focus of my study, before the French colonization of Algeria, there were very few Christians. It is not true in relation to the Middle East. It is not true in relation to Palestine, obviously, but in relation to the North Africa, from a certain time in history, the Christians were mainly the colonizers. It was the Spanish colonizers who colonized North Africa for several times, and later the French. So it's not that there are no Christian in this world, but in North Africa, which is the focus of my engagement, we're speaking about mainly the Judeo-Muslim world, but it doesn't say that there is no place to Christian in it. What I'm trying to do by retracing the Jewish Muslim world is actually struggling against the engineering of our mind to believe that Jews belong only to this invented tradition, which is the Judeo-Christian, and to open up the decolonization of Palestine together with the decolonization of the Jews from Zionism, the decolonization of the world from Zionism, and for the possibility to recover many of the Jewish Muslim traditions. And just one word, Islam didn't know a moment without the protection of Jews in the Ummah from its inception in the 7th century until the French colonization of Africa.
And I'm going to read Sarah's comment, which really connects quite well with what you've just said. Sarah says the keys incorporated into the jewelry are particularly poignant, I think referring to one of the images you showed us, Ariella. as we've seen Palestinians holding on to the keys of their homes from which they were expelled. I also remember my father, who was a Sephardic Jew, talking about las llaves, excuse my pronunciation, the keys that Spanish Jews may have kept when they were expelled from their homes. And there was one more question that came in from Joe Turpin, who asks, in Fanon's A Dying Colonialism, he devotes a paragraph addressing Algeria's Jews where he states, it is not true that the Jew is in favor of colonialism and that the Algerian people reject him and relegate him to the camp of the oppressors. Joe Turpin asks, how valuable can this perspective be in the Jewish position within decolonization, and are people aware of this perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both, Joe and Sarah, for this comment. And thank you for, speaking about the keys of the expellees from Spain in the 15th century. Just to remind ourselves that Jews and Muslims were expelled together from Spain in different waves. And in relation to the question about Fanon has in Dying Colonialism 4 or 5 pages about the Jews. If I remember well, this quotation is from this text. And yes, what he says here, it is as if he's reconciling the Jews with the local population and saying they never treated them as such. But the question is how we understand the presence of the Jews in North Africa, in Africa, for thousands of years, not through the lens that the colonizers forced on indigenous population to see the Jews as a separate group toward which the local population, the Muslims, have a certain attitude toward. The question is how we reinscribe the Jews as part of Africa from thousands of years as Amazigh before they were Judaized, before they were Arabized, before they were Islamized. And if there are Jews today in North Africa, they were Arabized and Islamized. This is why they didn't find their way out at the end of the colonial project. But we have exactly to let revive this plurality of identities that we had once we were in North Africa, that were irreducible to the European or the Zionist narratives of who the Jews are. Thank you.